Warhammer has plenty of things in it that are absolutely terrifying. Even ignoring Warhammer horror, which I have on reasonably good authority is a smart thing to do, most people would agree that if you look at something like a Hive Tyrant, you're probably recoloring your pants brown. To say nothing of the Dark Eldar, who get the gold medal in Fates Worse Than Death, or the Vampire Counts, who are vampires and scary by default. Hard not to be frightening when you got ghosts in your army, you know? And of course, there's plenty of individual characters that are horrifying all to themselves. Conrad Kurz, Conrad von Karstein, both named Conrad, both completely insane, and both of them are tied for the last person you'd ever want to meet in a dark alley. Especially amongst the eviler factions, there's all sorts of horror to be found, but that doesn't mean it's just the bad guys that are terrifying. To be entirely honest with you, most characters you read about as the protagonists of any Warhammer story is terrifying in their own right. They end up at the thickest of battles, leaving countless dead in their wake, and by the end of it, they've done things that by all rights would make the average person terrified. And just because October is past at time of uploading doesn't mean we can't talk about some real scary folks in the setting. Horror's a year-round thing. So today, let me tell you about some of the standout characters and a few other things in Warhammer lore that if you spend a little bit of time thinking about them, you discover that they're worse than plenty of the things that already go bump in the night. But before we get to Warhammer time, tell me, do you like food? I would assume so, given that you are presumably a human being, and we tend to need to eat. If that sounds like you, then you could use Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is the premier meal delivery service. You know what can be a lot more stressful than it has any right to be? Figuring out what to eat. You gotta figure out what you want, you gotta actually prepare it, which can take hours, and if you're on a diet or just watching what you eat in general, there's all sorts of different nutrition facts to consider. Well, with Factor, that all melts away. There's no grocery store trips, no prep work, no getting tired of cooking. The chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals Factor delivers are healthy, delicious, and heat up in just 2 minutes. And it's incredibly flexible. You can change your plan every week, getting anywhere from 4 to 18 meals a week or pausing your deliveries outright. My eating habits tend to follow 2 patterns. I forget to eat and suddenly it's the middle of the night and I don't feel like cooking, and even if not, my sleep schedule's a bit of a complete wreck and I just eat at a weird time regardless. Factor helps me with both of those issues. I fire up the microwave for 2 minutes and I've got a delicious meal. I have yet to eat a Factor meal that I do not like, and because I can get them ready to go basically instantly, I never stress about what to eat when I have them to hand. And if all this sounds good to you, which it really should, allow me to sweeten the deal just for you, dear viewer. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50pancreas to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50pancreas at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Food doesn't need to be stressful, and with Factor, it's hassle-free, delicious, and healthy. So get yourself some Factor meals today and get ready to enjoy your meals like never before. Now then, I hope you're ready to listen to me explain how some of your favorite protagonists are really just horrifying. We're going to start off with the inspirations for this video themselves, and spoiler alert, yes, I did mostly just want to spend more time talking about Gotrek and Felix, so I made a video idea to give me the excuse. Gotrek and Felix are of course many things, as is fitting for the 2 characters that I believe have the most amount of Warhammer books explicitly dedicated to them. They're of course brave warriors, either because of a religiously mandated death wish, or because the only other option is death, for Gotrek and Felix respectively. They're murder hobos, because unless there's only one of something in Warhammer fantasy, they've probably killed it, and in some cases they've killed the only one of something in the setting, like whatever the hell the sleeper was. And they're funny, because sometimes their fight read more like slapstick comedy. Case in point, I'm pretty sure the only opponents to outright beat them in combat were 2 schmucks wielding a couch as a weapon. Which by power scalar logic means those 2 could each solo a bloodthirster, by the way, just in case you didn't think power scaling was stupid enough already. Scary might not be the first thing to come to your mind, though. Felix's inner monologue is usually how he's desperately holding back the urge to piss himself in fear, and Gotrek, while the single deadliest combatant in all of Warhammer, is usually not going around killing innocent people. Usually. Don't interrupt him drinking, and that statement doesn't have to be a lie. Spoiler alert again, it's the thumbnail of this video, but the Skaven don't view them as the heroic icons of Warhammer fantasy. The Skaven, and Thanquol in particular, view them as bringers of death and destruction wherever they go. There's never been an exact body count for the amount of really anything this pair has slaughtered, but with the Skaven I can guarantee that between direct combat and as a side effect of their doings, it's at least in the 5 digits. Picture you're a clan rat during a battle this pair are in. You're of course afraid, because all Skavens are cowards at heart, but it's the baseline level of fear that the Skaven always operate at. Afraid of the rat behind you stabbing you in the back, afraid you won't be able to successfully stab the rat in front of you in the back, and afraid one of the man-things might get a shot off at you too. But all things considered, you're surrounded by other rats to take the hits for you, and the finest horrors of Skavendom are assaulting the no-furs. Everything should be okay. Then one of those weird orange-haired dwarfs starts cutting his way through entire formations of rats at a time. Every swing is at least one dead Skaven, usually 2 or 3 at once. You're getting closer and closer to him, or rather he's getting closer and closer to you, and you're realizing that the concept of exhaustion seems to be afraid of this dwarf too, because he isn't slowing down. Suddenly a cart barrels through the area you're fighting in, with a rat ogre hot on its trail. Perfect. Once the rat ogre takes care of the dwarf and the blonde human on the cart, it'll turn around and kill this dwarf. Then the human chucks a bomb down its throat, blows it up, and then leaps off the cart and starts killing rats too. This happens in the series. Slightly exaggerated on my part, I admit, but I'd wager that's how it looked from the Skaven viewpoint. There's a reason that when Gotrek showed back up in the Mortal Realms in AOS, Thanquol's reaction wasn't to ask who he was because he forgot, or to casually dismiss him as some relic that can't stand against him nowadays. No, Thanquol freaked the hell out because that's Gotrek Gurnison, and just because he's missing his taller half doesn't mean he's any less of a monster. If anything, you can argue that he's worse now, because his moral compass didn't quite make it to the Age of Sigmar with him. Even other good guy factions view them with no small amount of fear. For Gotrek, as I've said before, he made Teclis freak out. The guy could blow up cities with a thought, and the moment he looked at Gotrek and that fancy axe he was holding, he started being a whole lot less dismissive of his newfound companion. If it was Gotrek in the Immortal Empires trailer at the meeting instead of Thorgrim, the word short wouldn't have left that elf's mouth. For Felix, it's a bit more of a low-key thing, and spoilers for one of the later Gotrek and Felix books. I think it was Elfslayer, but I don't remember exactly, because when you read 18 books and 6 omnibuses within the span of about a year, the specifics tend to meld a bit in your brain. When Felix met Max Schreiber again, it had been no small amount of years. Naturally, Max had aged, because being a wizard doesn't mean you don't grow old. Felix looked identical, though, and when Max pointed it out, Felix at first thought he was just being polite. But Max insisted with no small amount of concern that, no, Felix, you look exactly the same as you did over a decade ago. In the settings of Warhammer, someone magically not aging is cause for worry, because there's probably something sinister going on. Felix, as it turns out, had stopped being a completely normal human being at some point in their journey, or was being kept alive by the powers that be for an unknown reason. One of those things is true, both are scary to consider, and I'm not going to tell you which is true because you should go read the goddamn books yourself. They're really good. Beyond that, a lot of the praise Felix gets comes from what I assume extreme circumstances preventing it from becoming a bit horrifying to onlookers. During the final book, Felix doesn't quite understand why the humans traveling with them are so insistent that he's some heroic figure. Sure, he's taken down some pretty nasty chaos monsters and warriors, but Gotrek did most of the work. It just didn't factor in that most people are getting cut down, Gotrek or not, and he really is just a badass. But now let's imagine that scenario without the end times to give it context. You're some Imperial State Trooper, which means you're a random schmuck given a spear, a helmet, a chestplate, and some other armor if you're lucky. Your squad's under attack by a Chaos Warband, but just before you get obliterated, Gotrek comes in and takes the leader head on. Felix, meanwhile, cleans up the rest of them and then offers you a hand up. From your perspective, it isn't that gif of Mercy showing up to save the kid in the rubble. It's this grimy dude who looks halfway feral from the adrenaline coursing through his veins, reaching down for you after he cut down some of Norsca's strongest insane asylum escapees. You probably aren't going to be feeling hero worshiper awe. You're going to be feeling the need to curl up and pray to Sigmar that you finally wake up from this nightmare. And remember, Gotrek survived into AOS in the realm of chaos. He fought so long and so hard that eventually demons stopped attacking him. In his own words, they grew bored. But tell me, do you think that even if the other 3 chaos gods stopped, that Khorne would pull back from a fight like that? I don't think so. I think they were afraid of the dwarf. And anyone that can scare the Chaos God should by all means put at least a little bit of fear in your heart, because if you can make the primordial gods that ended the world fear for their safety, what can he do to you? And if nothing else, from a meta perspective, this is the last pair you ever want to have in your little adventuring party. Because it doesn't mean that you've just gained 2 of the strongest allies you could hope for. It means that you and everyone around you are now the side characters in a Gotrek and Felix story. And without much spoiling, those tend to not have a very long life expectancy. This duo is horrifying. They're fun to read about, they're some of the best characters in Warhammer period, and by Sigmar, if I was in the same postcode as them, I'd leave as quickly as I possibly could. On the subject of those 2 though, Thanquol. Thanquol is another character that you usually laugh at first and then keep laughing at, because he is the horned rat, silliest clown thing fighting his toughest battle fights. Every story he's in has him failing at something. He fails in Gotrek and Felix because Gotrek is very much still alive and Thanquol had nothing to do with what got Felix in the end times. He fails at remaining at power, although he does succeed at somehow getting it back to lose later. He fails at communing with the demons of his race, because when you accidentally summon Scarbrand instead of a Vermin Lord, then things probably aren't going to plan. Granted, that is pretty spectacular, but still a failure. Then you watch Thanquol rail a line of Warpstone and delete a Skaven assassin with his magic. One moment he's there, the next he's not. Because Thanquol is one of the most powerful characters in Warhammer Fantasy. It's just he's such a failure-prone idiot, you never quite feel the full extent of what he can do. But I promise that if you don't have plot armor, you don't want to fight Thanquol. It'll end horribly for you. Let's go through the two big reasons as to why. Reason 1, Thanquol without failure involved. I know that's an insane concept, but hear me out. Thanquol is one of the single most powerful mages in Warhammer. He's almost wrestled blimps out of the sky, only being stopped by another one of the most powerful wizards in Warhammer. Additionally, even though Skaven are highly resistant to Warpstone, they still can suffer some ill effects, but Thanquol never really seems to get any of those, which means it's basically a free power boost for him. And he's the most Skaven-y Skaven to ever exist. He backstabs everyone who comes within 3 feet of them, and if he doesn't, he horribly abuses them. If he's not doing either of these things, it just means that he isn't in a position to do it at that moment, and he'll sure as hell try later on. All that power in the palm of the world's greatest megalomaniac. Whenever he's around, people are dying, and he's incredibly influential too, like I said. Sure, it waxes and wanes as he fails and then BS's his way back into power, but at any given moment, Thanquol can probably afford to throw the worst of Skavendom at you. So even if he doesn't get you because you're a blank from 40k that got lost in Fantasy or AOS, Bone Ripper version 40,000 probably will. But what about when he's failing? Well, he's even scarier. Failure for most people is usually bad for them. Sometimes people fail in ways that harm others, but usually it's just bad for you. You fail a test, so your grade goes down. You fail some task or other at work, so you have to spend more time working on it, and there might be other penalties. Thanquol fails, and then a whole bunch of dwarfs and Skaven have to deal with Scarbrand. Thanquol fails, and the Aiden and the Thiepkin have their existence revealed to Nagash, as well as millions of Skaven being drowned. Thanquol fails, and everyone in the area but Thanquol have to deal with the consequences. Thanquol is scary both because he's incredibly powerful when he needs to be, and because everything he does is like a Tom and Jerry skit if it played out in real life where we don't have cartoon physics. Turns out when an anvil falls on your head in the real world, you just die. But moving into 40k land for a bit, how about we look at the Primarchs? Any of them, it doesn't matter. They're all mind-shatteringly terrifying, from Guilliman and Sanguinius to Angron and Kurz. One of the reasons also applies to Space Marines themselves, so let's talk about that first. Transhuman Dread. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm fairly sure that it's an unintended side effect of the Space Marines' creation. Sure helpful though. Basically, you see a Space Marine, this huge armored soldier that you probably consider to be an angel of your god. The baseline feeling is already awe and probably a little bit of fear. You know, in spite of everything in your religion telling you that these are angels, that these men are capable of terrible, terrible violence. Bonus points, of course, if you're some form of traitor, or just generally a person the Imperium doesn't like, because in that case, you also know it's pointed at you. And then you see them move. In the blink of an eye, they close the distance before anyone can react and rip you in half. If you do fire back, there's a decent chance they dodge the shot, and if not, it'll probably not phase them anyways, unless you're a real good shot or you've got a real big gun. It can make people just freeze up. Fight or flight is not home right now, please leave a message at the death rattle. Scale it up to the Primarchs, and it's pretty much in the same vein as getting told to be not afraid. Sir, you're the son of the Emperor, who even if I don't call a god, I still revere him as one. This is the scariest moment of my life. This is something that's definitely headcanon of mine, but I like to imagine that every time someone talks to a Primarch, they by default have to have some amazing willpower. Because the average person would just go, Primarch, and just blue screen. If you know about the origins of the Primarch, then yeah, this makes plenty of sense. They're pieces of the Emperor himself, with each of them embodying something about him. And of course, if you think that whole Moloch business is true, then there's also some chaos juice in there that the Emperor took to help make him. Even if you don't know about those things, they're still coming into play. You just don't fully grasp the reason you look at the really tall guy and suddenly feel unworthy of continuing to breathe. Alternatively, you can picture it as an almost sort of overflow error. The awe and reverence you feel goes over the limit and it turns into terror. And while they're of course born of humanity and have very human traits, they're also fundamentally inhuman, because there isn't a single natural thing about the Primarchs. They were created in a lab using the pinnacle of genetic science available to mankind, and the magical knowledge of the eldritch horror that is the God Emperor. You don't need me to tell you the Emperor can be scary. He eats 1,000 people a day. You don't do that and not be at least a little bit scary to most people. But a lot of people talk about the Primarchs and only ever really call the obvious ones scary. Kurz, Angron, the big bad boys who helped ruin everything even more than it already had been ruined. Which is fair, those guys definitely have a leg up in the field of making me shit my pants, but the very existence of the Primarchs is horrifying. From an in-universe religious perspective, it's like I said, Be not afraid? Sir, I'm terrified. From a meta perspective, there are a million different laws, both natural and man-made, that they surely break with their existence. Though not always jump scare scary, the Primarchs are horrifying. For every reason you can think of that someone would be unsettled by a space marine, multiply it by 1,000 for their fathers. For some less spectacular, but still certainly unsettling people, the Eldar. All of them. This is more of an in-universe thing, but even though I love them, I have to admit I'd probably also be unnerved by an Eldar if I saw one. I of course would get over it and immediately resume my normal tendencies, but at the first meeting, I too would be a bit freaked out. Remember that as much as the Eldar are elves, they're not Legolas. For starters, they are truly beautiful. That's not to say Orlando Bloom isn't a handsome fella, but the Eldar are on another level. The most beautiful race to ever exist. Too beautiful, even. The Eldar aren't supermodels, they aren't the love of your life who in your eyes is the most beautiful person ever, they aren't even time to open up a private tab kind of beautiful. They're so beautiful it loops around to be unnerving, like they scaled up out of the uncanny valley but then forgot something and turned right back around. Imagine an anime character in real life, but they still have the proportions of an anime character. Depending on how the Eldar are being portrayed, that's what it is to look at one. This one admittedly isn't always the case, since many times in official art they are just hot person with pointy ears, but sometimes they are portrayed this way. They move in a way we see as wrong too. It's like flowing water combined with how a cat moves, as if it's both effortless for them to walk and as if they're a predator through and through. A creature born to be the top of the food chain, one that will always be a predator and only isn't devouring you alive because you're 10 times bigger than it. You can tell I'm more of a dog person. They don't just walk over to say hello, they appear at your side. You see movement, you register they've gone from point A to point B, but they didn't walk over. It's unsettling. Not perhaps outright scary, but much like their beauty, it registers in your brain as something fundamentally incorrect as to how something so human-like should move. It's like the building up to a jump scare. Whether or not one comes, you feel uneasy. Watching them converse with each other would also be unsettling, because they don't even need to talk to do it. The Eldar can have an entire conversation with subtle gestures, all without a single word. Aside from probably being a handy skill to have in the thick of combat, I really do think it'd just be unsettling to watch happen as a human. It'd be like being the only person in a D&D party that doesn't have access to the message cantrip. Everyone else is speaking in their respective minds, because why not? But you, the poor bastard who didn't pick a wizard because someone needed to be the tank, just watch your friends blink and occasionally furrow their eyebrows before they announce the next plan of action. I'm speaking from experience on that one, by the way, although I wasn't the poor bastard. Wasn't quite an all-wizard party since it was Star Wars, but turns out when all but one party member is a Sith, then one person has to miss out on the rebranded D&D spell. In combat, they put that inhuman grace to warfare, and an Eldar invasion is shock and awe at its highest extent. Remember how I said Marines cause transhuman dread in part because something that big and bulky shouldn't be moving that quickly? The Eldar move faster than the Marines. Before you yell at me, go look at their respective tabletop speeds. Space Marines can cross a battlefield before you can finish blinking. The Eldar do it before you can start. So suddenly everything's on fire, your squad's dead, and just as your brain finally processes what the hell is happening, you've a sword through your gut and the Eldar that put it there is already leaping to the next target. And of course, they're all magic, or at the very least, they all have the potential to be magical. From humanity's perspective, this comes with all the baggage that sort of thing comes with in Warhammer. As far as humanity is concerned, every psyker's a time bomb. Sooner or later, it'll probably end badly for them and everyone around them. Now an Eldar party comes along and oh look at that, you're surrounded by psykers. Ultimately though, the real reason the Eldar are so unsettling comes from the fact they look so human. They're thin and lanky and far too gorgeous, but they still look human. But everything about them is just wrong enough to give you the impression that they're wearing a skin suit, or they're an imposter, or any other reason you can think of as to why something so alien looks so close to human. It really is them living in the uncanny valley. For everything that makes them understandable and relatable, there's something else we just can't accept or even process as being normal. Aside from the psyker thing, the reasons for why the Eldar are somewhat scary are pretty mundane, I admit. But it would make the average person wary of them. They aren't human, and their closeness to a human is what makes them all the more able to make you feel uneasy. Talking to an Eldar wouldn't necessarily be talking to some enlightened being, though I will of course champion them being the greatest still. It'd be talking to something that despite how close it is to being human, every instinct you have would be screaming that it isn't. That what you're talking to is something you should be very, very afraid of, and that your best bet is to get as far away as you possibly can so you never have to see it again. Except for Imperials in the know, and of course us as audience members, you know that's not really possible. Because the webway gates mean that no matter where you are or who you are, you're never more than a few moments away from the Eldar suddenly popping by for a visit. And with them comes all the fear, uncertainty, and worry that comes with the Eldar deciding that you are worth their attention. Obviously, of course, all this applies to the Dark Eldar too, aside from the Psyker stuff since they've let their psychic prowess degrade. But you don't need me to tell you the Dark Eldar are scary. Mother of all no shit statements that, isn't it? A quick shout out to literally any Imperial structure of sufficient size, because in no particular order, here's a short list of why they're all horrifying. There's probably a massive number of people who died to build it, it's likely maintained by lobotomized human beings who also might still be conscious but unable to do anything about it, because servitors are horrifying on their own. There's almost certainly a huge number of disheveled and impoverished people living just under it in the worst conditions, because the difference between an Imperial city and a Skaven city is just that humans live in one and rat people in another. And once the buildings start getting big enough in the Imperium, there's a decent chance that there's so many people on the planet that they're eating dead people for food, because mass cannibalism is socially acceptable in the Imperium of Man. If you include spaceships in this category, you get the bonus fun of entire shanty towns of people living in the same situation as everyone I just talked about, except now they don't even know of life outside the ship. With a dual feature here for this next one, we have both the Necrons and the Tomb Kings. Not in the traditional way they're shown to be horrifying, since they're endless marching legions of the undead at the behest of their commanders, although to be sure, I'm not signing up to fight either of them. These are more commonly considered things about these factions than the rest of what I've talked about, but usually people just talk about how awesome they are. Myself included, praise be to mighty Petra and glory to Cetra. Imagine realizing one day that you really need to breathe. But you can't breathe. You don't have lungs. For half an hour you sit there desperately trying to breathe over and over and over in spite of the fact that your lungs are gone, or in the case of some of the lucky Tomb Kings, just rotted to the point of uselessness. Or you look up into the sky and go to appreciate the nice breeze, but you can't feel it. You can't feel anything. You have no skin to feel the breeze on. You have no nerves to register any feeling. You can never feel again. All you have is either cold hard circuitry, or desiccated organs, or even just your skeletal structure animated by magic cast by your nation's greatest enemy. There is nothing for you again like this. No food, no enjoying a warm shower, no cold breezes. For the vast majority of them, there's nothing except maybe the barest remnant of their former selves. Necron warriors retain the barest sense of animalistic fears, which is granted likely just to justify them having a leadership score. But the end result is that for the vast majority of Necrons, the only thing they're still capable of feeling is fear, and they almost never even get that. For a Tomb King's example, potters will mindlessly sculpt clay as they once did in life. They don't know why, they don't have a true end goal, be it as their job or hobby or whatever, they just do it, because all that's left is dust and echoes. And for both, this existence will never end. The Necron's reanimation protocols can fail, but this is either an incredible rarity or requires incredibly specific circumstances to reliably make them fail. Over and over again will a Necron be thrown into battle at the command of their masters. Over and over again will the pointless infighting of their dynasties take place. For the Tomb Kings, Nagash's magic was so powerful that there is no end to them. It twisted the sacred rites that buried the kings and ensured they never stopped coming back. And for the common soldiers, it's a mix of the mortuary cult's magic as well as Nagash's that keeps them from ever resting. Arguably, it's even worse for the Tomb Kings, since at least the souls of the Necron tier are gone. The Tomb Kings aren't. Whatever afterlife awaits the Necrons, the Tomb Kings will never see theirs. Though they all distract themselves from their situation in some way or other, the Necrons and Tomb Kings can never escape the fact that they're fundamentally broken. They've lost their lives, and they will never know peace. Once again, this isn't jump scare horror, and looking from the outside in, you might feel more pity than terrified. But to be placed into the body of a Necron would be to sacrifice all feeling, all creativity, everything that makes you, you. To become a Tomb King is to know nothing but the endless desert winds stripping away at your bones for all time. It's a good thing that the Tomb Kings at least still have their skeletal mouths, because all they can do is scream. And for one last bit of horror that you might not expect to some of Warhammer's factions and characters, let's bring it back down to the individual level, and mix it with a time-honored tradition I've created for this channel. Yapping about elves. Aenarion. Pretty important to High Elf lore. 6,000-ish years after his death, the dude's name is still regularly shouted as a High Elf battle cry. Just go click on a High Elf settlement in Total Warhammer. There's a decent chance they'll shout Aenarion's will, because they revere him. To be fair, he did save Ulthuan, fought 4 greater demons at once, presumably fought a whole lot more as well as countless lesser demons before that, and started a bloodline that would go on to influence both the elves and the Warhammer world for good and bad for the rest of the setting. And given that his son, ex-wife, and great-great-great-grandsons are gods in the setting, he's got no small amount of influence in Age of Sigmar, too. and he's a monster. Aenarion was a wanderer before the Great Catastrophe and the coming of chaos. Traveled the world, saw cool things, probably did cool things. He came back home to see that demons had invaded his entire country, and the rest of the world for that matter, so he started dealing with it. And he couldn't, and it was pretty miserable for everyone involved. Turns out the combination of the elves never having been tested in true warfare, as well as trying to wage a war of attrition against infinity, is not a winning one. And then he got news that most people don't want to hear. His wife had been killed by demons. In truth, she hadn't been, but to the knowledge of the elves and Aenarion himself, Asteriel was murdered by chaos. And this is when Aenarion goes from noble heroic defender to an amalgamation of every horror movie villain, because if you know anything about fantasy, you know what he does next. He goes up to the Sword of Cain and pulls it from the stone. The horror of the first act of Aenarion's downfall is a lot of the same kind of horror that we get in prequel movies that explain a villain's origin story, and I do hope you'll excuse the next few sentences because they might come across a bit pretentious. At least by this channel standards they might. That, and I just wanted an excuse to talk about Star Wars and Transformers. It's the same rising dread you get watching the Clone Wars every time Anakin does some new flavor of war crime and the Imperial March Sting plays. Knowing full well that this heroic Jedi Knight is going to turn into the Sith Lord due to canon, but really wanting it not to. Or like Transformers 1, watching D16's eyes slowly change to become redder and redder over the film as his world keeps breaking apart until he rips Sentinel in half and rises up to become Megatron. Side note, because I know a couple of friends in a D&D camp I'm in watch my stuff, remember when you asked what Kadite's end goal was? It's this. The droids will be free. But ignoring homebrew D&D nonsense, that's the horror of Aenarion at first, and interestingly enough, it's addressed in the setting as such. Everyone from his best friend Caelidor who saw his future, to the Elf Pantheon, to the Chaos Gods themselves were telling him that grabbing the sword is full stop not worth it. It is going to curse you and your bloodline forever, and for the love of God, stop what you're doing right now. But he was so filled with rage that most people who might have gone to talk to him just stopped and couldn't even meet his eyes. Can you imagine looking someone like that in the face? What else but fear would you feel when confronted with a man who was so filled with hatred and malice that he ignored the warnings of every god in the setting except for maybe Cain when they told him this was a bad idea? Because at that point you aren't talking to a dude, you're trying to talk down the Doomslayer with pointier ears. Whenever someone normal interacts with him, you can see the fear in their eyes. That was Aenarion at this point. And then he draws it and becomes more traditionally horrifying. For similar reasons to Gotrek and Felix, honestly. Oh, sure, hearing about the noble hero take on Chaos Warriors brings the High Elves hope and courage. But seeing this twitching, frothing madman rip apart a Keeper of Secrets before looking around with hate in his eyes is a different feeling to hearing about it. Aenarion fought the demons of chaos in the same way Pellinal Whitestrake fought the Aelids. He obliterated them. The Sword of Cain almost completely corrupts anyone who wields it. I say almost because Aenarion did eventually put it back and Tyrion was purged of his own corruption. But all that means in the end is that they eventually stopped their massive murder spree. Until then, it was a non-stop rampage that the gods themselves could only watch in horror at. And I really want to just double down on that, because both interpretations of why the Chaos Gods told him to stop are terrifying in their own way. The first is just that they were telling him it wasn't worth it because they feared how strong he'd become if he grabbed the sword. That's less interesting, but also goes to show how monstrously powerful he'd be. By grabbing the sword, this mighty but otherwise completely mortal warrior would become a being so strong the Chaos Gods themselves would fear what he could do. That's its own kind of scary. The fear of something so monstrously powerful the gods themselves fear it, like Gotrek. On your side or not, that's gonna unsettle you. The other interpretation is that Aenarion was walking down a path so messed up that the Chaos Gods were honestly telling him it wasn't worth it. To hell with Khorne here, Slaanesh was telling someone to rein it in and pull back on their desires and emotions. That isn't horrifying, because there's no word for that kind of thing. Worth noting is that he had time in between drawing the sword and his death to found the Kingdom of Nagaryth. It was indeed around this time he took Morathi as his next wife, who would give birth to Malekith. And in the Kingdom of Nagaryth, it was Aenarion's own house of horrors. Demons, cultists, really anyone Aenarion felt deserved it were put down like animals. Which included, by the way, people who told him to chill the hell out. The elves there weren't far off from Slaaneshi cultists themselves, given that Morathi was partially in charge, and because the end of the world does not make for stable people. Other elves viewed going to Nagaryth in the same way people might view going to that one part of the nearest city, because it really was just a complete shithole. Only of course with the added bonus of it being a magical place, because everyone there is an elf, so whatever horrible things you can imagine, dial them up a bit. And let's not forget the lasting legacy of Aenarion's decision. In his grief-fueled rage, he indirectly caused pretty much everything horrible in the Warhammer world going forward. The Elf Civil War, the War of the Beard, Nagash, everything that snowballed from Arathi and Malekith being awful themselves stems from Aenarion's act here. That's the kind of realization that will make any in-setting historians have a Darkest Dungeon-style mental break. Aenarion checks off pretty much every tick you can think of for why he's scary. Jump scare scary, dreadful scary, horrific scary, I mean different things with all of those, I promise. This man, arguably more than any other, was the ultimate reason you can trace all the evils of the Warhammer world back to. Because while yes, the Dark Elves are the ones more directly behind a lot of it, you don't get Dark Elves if Aenarion doesn't pull the Sword of Cain. And while it isn't entirely Aenarion's doing what happens next, I feel I should mention a little bit of Age of Sigmar here. When Morathi was ascending to godhood, she needed the bits of Osirion's power within the Phoenix Kings that Slaanesh had eaten. She consumed most of them with little difficulty, but when she got to the first and last, she hesitated because even after all this time, she still felt some small bit of genuine love for her husband. And he cut her in half because of it. And while it was partially because of Morathi's vestigial love and partially because of Osirion's power, it was still Aenarion cutting a god in half, while in the stomach of another god that had eaten him. Which means that fear the Chaos Gods had about him becoming potentially too powerful for even them to handle? They were right. And that's some of the Warhammer characters and aspects that are a whole lot scarier than you might think at first glance. I'm sure there's plenty more, but those are the standouts to me. That, and there's only so many ways I can say this thing is actually scary without it getting old. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the overshadowed horror to my Warhammer characters, something always there that really brings things together. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Aenarion the Defender, more like Aenarion the I wanna fuck your wife.